Okay, and we are being recorded. Okay, give me 1 minute. We'll kick off. Just got to close this Q&A box here. Got too many boxes open. All right, thanks everyone for joining us today. I know some, but not all of you who are with us. My name is Jessica Silver, and I'm the Assistant Comptroller for Public Affairs for New York City Comptroller Scott Stringer. And today's program is being presented for our current CUNY fellows and the office's summer interns, as well as the broader CUNY community. So I know some of you are joining us today might be current CUNY students or faculty, and welcome. We're so glad to have you with us. This is part of our CUNY fellowship program, and we're delighted to bring this to a broader community today. Before we start, I want to make sure anyone who would like to follow on closed captions is able to. We're going to have live captioning throughout the program. You just go to the bottom of the screen, you'll see a closed captioning button. If you click it and put show subtitles, you'll be able to read everything we're saying. And today's presentation is about the role of a Chief Diversity Officer. And we're going to start with a presentation from Wendy Garcia, who is our Chief Diversity Officer here at the Comptroller's Office. Her presentation will run probably less than a half hour, and then we're going to save the second half hour of this session for questions and answers. And we have a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. If you'd like to ask a question, just type it in. We'll probably wait till the presentation's over to start answering them, but we'll pull as many questions as we can out of the question box, and I will ask them to Wendy, and hopefully we'll have a chance to get to all of them or many of them. And now I'd like to introduce Wendy to you. Wendy Garcia is the New York City Comptroller's Chief Diversity Officer. This is a position that was created for our office. We were the first ones in New York City government. And in her role, Wendy is responsible for increasing contracting opportunities for women and minority-owned businesses. She manages the Comptroller's Office Internal Supplier Diversity Initiative, as well as a number of other diversity-related projects across the bureaus of our office. And before Wendy was our Chief Diversity Officer, she was actually our Deputy Chief Diversity Officer. So she has a lot of experience in this field, and I'm really delighted that she's able to speak to you all today. And I'm going to turn the floor right over to her for the presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Jessica. I am so excited to be here with all of you and joined by Jessica. Jessica forgot to mention one thing, which is Jessica was part of the sounding board in the creation of this position. So I am so grateful to have worked with her all these years. So a lot of the work that you're going to see here, Jessica was a critical part of a lot of the decision making behind it. We are going to go ahead and start. As Jessica said, a lot of you here are wondering how to be a Chief Diversity Officer. If you're in college or you are in the middle of planning your next steps, you're probably thinking like, what are the skill sets that I need to have in order to move forward? Or you're just trying to figure out, well, how does she do it? And maybe I can figure it out from there. So we'll do a little bit of skill sets. We'll talk a little bit about how I got into this position. And then I'll give you some recommendations at the end. So a little bit about me. As Jessica said, I am New York City Comptroller's Chief Diversity Officer. When I first started, I was the Deputy Chief Diversity Officer. So I grew in the position. Right before that, I worked as the Director of Community Outreach for the New York City Department of Youth and Community Development. And I work collaboratively with hundreds of nonprofits looking at their contracting process, looking at partnerships in the community, and also developing workforce programs for young people across the city of New York. Before that, I was the Deputy Director at the Manhattan Borough President's Office, which meant I had to be the eyes and ears for the Borough President on everything above 96th Street. I specifically worked with the Latino community at that time, with the immigrant community. I worked on issues of housing, and really looking at how government navigates and helps people navigate throughout the city. And I was a research assistant at the Rockefeller Foundation at Baruch College as well. That was an amazing job where I learned a lot and helped write a extensive research around how immigrant nonprofits do work around that. I think we're having a quick technical issue that Kevway is working through right now. But just to talk a little bit about my background in terms of school, I went to the University of Delaware. I got my bachelor's in urban policy and management, had a concentration in economic development. And before that, I went to the University of Delaware, where I majored in international relations and public science and political science. One of the things that I think I recommend to everyone watching is that just get a clear understanding that there's no one path as you're building your track record. And what you really want to do is just always keep following your heart. One of the things I can tell you that you'll see in my resume, there's a few consistent items. One of the consistent items is that, and I'm going to go ahead and probably try to pull up the PowerPoint, okay? On my own, Kevway, is that okay? And one of the things that I have thought through in this process is that if you follow your heart and you're doing what you love the most, you'll land exactly where you need to be. So as you're thinking through your track record and what you want to do, it is part of that. Jessica, would you like me to pull up the PowerPoint?
I'll try. I'm sorry, everyone. We're having
Will you try?
small
Okay.
technical difficulty. Give us one moment and we'll get the PowerPoint ready.
And so as they do that, I encourage you that as you are thinking through your own resume, try to stay consistent in the areas that you are the most passionate about, and that you feel you are living the most in your purpose. What you'll see in mine is that I knew that I was passionate about immigrant issues. I knew I was passionate about communities of color. I knew that I was passionate about disenfranchised young people. And so I was consistent in 14 years in government in really focusing on the items that, that I knew I wanted to build skill sets in.
1 minute. So sorry, everyone.
All right.
Okay, I think we are good to go. Let me just try to share the screen. Can everyone see that?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, let me just get the show going. Is this the right slide for you?
Yep, that's the right slide. And I'll just say next slide, that way it'll.
Perfect, perfect.
We will. And so, so many of you may be wondering, so then what is the Chief Diversity Officer? What do you do all day, Wendy? One of the things that I have to do every single day is I have to function as the Chief Strategist reporting to the Controller. I have to make sure that I identify and I address the impact of systemic racism within the Controller's office. And that can mean everything from the boardroom to workplace, to the supply chain, to the operations, to internal policy. So it really goes across the full organization. Some people want to know how much money we make, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. The work also includes making sure that you're tracking data and monitoring it and developing recommendations and solutions. You always want to give a recommendation. So if you see a systemic problem, if you see a racial issue that occurs, using data to back it up, to show the patterns is going to be critically important. So if you're in school and you're taking statistical analysis class, or you're taking some kind of Excel, like learning how to put together formulas, these things will come in good use if you want to be a chief diversity officer, because you need to be able to really look at data, analyze it, and see where the patterns are going. You also part of the work is also informing and communicating and engaging with others, whether that's internal or external. I have a board of advisory board members that I work with, and then I have 14 bureau heads that I have to work with as well, and key stakeholders around the city of New York that the controller and I have to answer to, that really impact the work. So if we have stakeholders that are saying, hey, we're seeing a pattern that Hispanics and African Americans are not getting their fair share in, let's say, construction, or that Asians are not being acknowledged in the professional service sector, or that there's not enough women on boards, those are issues that external stakeholders can really help you understand. But then part of it, and the main part of this, is that you have to create a solution for it. So very important for you to understand historical context, data, and also be able to make recommendations. Next slide. A little bit about the Chief Diversity Officer position. You may be wondering why didn't I major in Chief Diversity Officer-ness? When I was going to school, there was no Chief Diversity Officer role. As we talked about earlier, this is the first time in the history of the Controller's Office and New York City that they saw a Chief Diversity Officer. You're talking about 8 years ago. So the role had not at that time, now it is, been developed in its expansion the way it is right now. All of you are sitting at such a momentous time because the role is now finally being put into the fabric of every single organization, and we're seeing that happen very slowly. Some context on the evolution: in the 60s, there was a legal requirement through the Civil Rights Act of affirmative action. That's what began the CDO position. By the 1980s and the 1990s, you really saw chief diversity officers being hired as consultants and diversity compliance specialists, which is a lot different from being a CDO role. When you're just a consultant, you're really living outside of the organization, not inside. And being specialist also puts you lower in the realm in terms of an organization. So they didn't have a status as high as it exists now. By 1981, all the way through 1991, there was actually a reduction of affirmative action programs in the United States, and the government actually reduced the legal requirements for chief diversity officers and specialists. At that time, it was specialists and consultants. So you can imagine we took as a society a couple steps forward in the 60s, and then we took many steps back around the 1990s. And then what we saw is that post 1990s, you started seeing companies, the private sector, taking it on as voluntary roles. And then you saw that living in human resources and doing human resource practice, it really wasn't across the board. Now, what we have, and we can go to the next slide, now what we really have is a whole revolution around this role. And an evolution that's really supporting how it should have looked from the beginning. And the reason this matters is because, as many of you know, last year, we saw so many public displays of racial inequity. We saw it with employees who were at the center of racial controversies at tech companies speaking out. That was in companies like Google or other tech companies highlighting that there were racial inequities within the company, that someone had to do something about it quickly. We saw companies like Gucci apologizing for the removed sweater following the blackface backlash. And all of this could have been discussed had they had a chief diversity officer, but because these were not items that were prioritized, you have backlash, thank God, from the community saying, like, we're not going to accept this kind of racial inequity. We're not going to accept this kind of disrespect. So it pushed companies to really start rethinking about how to prioritize CDOs at companies. if you look at, in the next slide, if you look at what is happening now, you're living at the epicenter of CDOs really growing, not just in the private sector with companies like Gucci and Google rethinking their diversity strategies, but you see federal government now talking through what they need to do different. And this is just in the last 6 months. On January 26th, we saw President Biden put an executive order not to renew contracts with private prisons to address racial inequities. We saw that the head of domestic policy in the Office of Management and Budget conducted an equity assessment. And you saw that government was going deep into spaces where communities of color were being impacted. Next slide. And the most important part of that is that what we've been seeing in our own office is that chief diversity officers are now being hired at a federal level as head of agencies. So we're seeing a lot of job descriptions calling on chief diversity officers to help run these top federal departments. So if you want to know what the Comptroller's Office does, how the Chief Diversity Officer in New York City, we talked a little bit about this earlier, but the context of this role is critical because of the way the Comptroller's Office functions. It's the fiscal watchdog of the city of New York. And the Chief Diversity Officer gets to ask the big question, which is, where and whom does this money come from? For years, we were managing money in the Comptroller's Office. This is before Comptroller Stringer came in, and not really asking, are women and people of color managing this money? What percentage do women and people of color get when it comes to each city agency around New York? How many people sit on boards on places where the Comptroller's Office votes? And over again, when in our office we were looking at the data, we kept finding that 5% of the city's budget was going to women and people of color. And this is out of $21 billion. Insane. When we asked a question around how many agencies are doing business with African Americans or Hispanic, we were seeing that it was less than 1%, less than 2%, consistently across the board. Insane. And then when we were looking at boards, the same percentage was coming up, less than 3%, less than 2%. And so we knew, because we collected the data, remember we talked about data earlier, that this urgently needed to be solved. What makes this office super unique is that we are an independent elected official. The office is really accountable directly to New Yorkers, and it holds other government agencies accountable, which allows us to then make independent decisions, to be creative and innovative when we're doing our work. So it can be exciting. And sometimes we can, if you see the Comptroller, you've probably seen him on TV or you've seen him in the news, you'll see that we're always pushing new agendas as we're putting things out. And as we talked about earlier, one of the biggest portfolios that we have is looking at our pension funds and how investors manage our money. And we did a lot of work there around diversity and inclusion as well. I wanted to talk a little bit about how the role has impacted our specific office. Number one, we have increased spending with women and minority-owned businesses in our office. When I first got here, we were at about $2 million. And just as of last year, we got to 7.4 million, which meant we are 50%. This year, we are now at 9 million. So we have been able to really triple our numbers since we got here. When I first got here, we graded city agencies, 32 of them. And we saw that only 4.9% of that went to women and minority-owned business. This is a consistent pattern, but One of the things that I'm most proud of is that because we did that report, because we did it for the last 8 years, and because we advocated for clear solutions, like having chief diversity officers in every single agency, just last summer, there was an executive order that designated having chief diversity officer for the first time in history. So it means that this office helped make history for the city of New York. Occurred just this past year. We have asked that every company give us diversity plans. We have mandated unconscious biases in our office, unconscious bias training in our office. And every year we've invested about $1 billion in minority investment firms. And we also push for our inclusion of LGBTQ firms in the MWB sector through our EBE program. Many of you may be thinking, well, who's hiring? And I think some of you were asking the question around how much money do CDOs make? We have seen CDO officers triple in the last 16 months. The hiring for CDOs is one of the largest hiring areas in the city. Well, and also across the nation, I shouldn't just say the city. In 2021, the CDO role had been considered mission critical in IT, in business, in HR, with 75% of companies really making up the bulk of that. Just to give you some examples, the Metropolitan Opera and Pearson hired chief diversity officers, and salaries really range. So for those of you wondering, like, how much do you make as a CDO? First, I just want to say chief diversity officer is normally, when done well, a C-suite level position or a cabinet level position, a senior level position, senior leadership position. All of these things mean the same thing. It just means that it should live in the president's office sphere. So whoever the president or the principal head is, it needs to be working in tandem directly with the president or the head of the company or firm. Salaries can range. They can be as low as $135 when you're talking about the nonprofit sector or smaller companies, or or if you're looking at the private sector and you're looking at large institutions that manage millions of dollars, it can be over $300,000. And every stance, though, it should be reporting to the head of the company. I just want to show you a quick video on when we were calling on having a chief diversity officer and why New Yorkers thought that it was important.
Give me a moment. We're going to try to get this going.
Okay.
We need a chief diversity officer.
I'm Reverend Al Sharpton. I stand with the control.
Well, 80% of New Yorkers are women or people of color. Just 5% of the spending on goods and services by our own city goes to MWBs. Just 5%.
MWBE is a business owned by a woman or a person of color. We are calling for a chief diversity officer.
Jessica, I think we may have to reload. It looks like some people can hear it.
That person will recite
Inclusion and equity.
chief diversity officer.
Sorry, is it not working?
Yeah, it looks like some people said they could hear it, but they couldn't see the video. There we go.
You can see it now?
Yeah, whatever you did before that worked.
Let's try again, guys.
Need a chief diversity officer.
I'm Reverend Al Sharpton. I stand with the control.
Well, 80% of New Yorkers are women or people of color. Just 5% of the spending on goods and services by our own city goes to MWBs. Just 5%.
MWBE is a business owned by a woman or a person of color. We are calling for a chief diversity officer.
The
Chief Diversity Officer here in New York City.
Chief Diversity Officer.
That person will add oversight.
Inclusion and equity.
Chief Diversity Officer is critically important in a place like New York City, the melting pot, the greatest city in the world.
Economic diversity spreads opportunity to help solve many problems that may exist.
With the controller leading this, it is in our interest to back it up. We must stand with him and make sure that this is put in the charter so that every agency duplicates what he's doing in the controller's office.
When we don't include everybody and every business owner, well, then we're not creating wealth throughout our city.
So hopefully you enjoyed the video. We'll talk a little bit about, some people are asking, I'll answer some questions where does 95% of the money of the city go to? It goes to what we call non-minority businesses. So it goes to white males. We're just gonna we're working on getting the PowerPoint, so it should be back really quick. I'm gonna take a look at the chat and see, I'll answer some questions while they pull up the PowerPoint.
I think it's back. Do you have it?
Yeah, we have it, we see it.
All right, sorry about this, guys. Let me see if I can. There we go.
Okay, so what does the future hold for all of you thinking about majoring in Chief Diversity Officer skill sets? Here are some things you should know that's happening now in the news. The Harvard Business School just appointed its first Chief Diversity Officer. Again, historical, we're talking about just this year. Bloomberg named a Chief Diversity Officer for inclusion. Comcast has done the same thing. Prada appointed a Chief Diversity Officer for North America. Bain Capital and the CDO Club announced 101 CDOs who have become CEOs. Critical, because that's what we're seeing. We're seeing that also at the Recording Academy, someone who held the position as a Chief Diversity Officer and now is the co-president for the Recording Academy. And we're also seeing the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, which is a recent also so we're seeing a trend, and I'm talking about just in the last 6 months, of the rapid hiring of Chief Diversity Officers. Some lessons that I have learned along the way that I wanted to share with some of you. Numbers speak for themselves. Using data consistently is going to be key to race-based gaps. So if you're thinking about what should I do, should I take the statistics class, take the stats class. We put this picture up there just so you can see how much it's needed. Many times I had to sit in front of an Excel sheet along with our IT team, along with our budget team, and really just crack open the numbers so we can take a look at how the finances of the city of New York was going when it came to women and minority-owned businesses. And we had to break that down by women. We had to break it down by how they were doing with Hispanics, how they were doing with Black Americans, how they were doing with Asian Americans, to really see if the trend was going up or down. And this is a picture from a few years ago on what the trend was with the controller. We were announcing the numbers for the city at that time. Lesson number 2, the best advice will come from the experts. You don't have to know everything as a Chief Diversity Officer, but you do have to surround yourself with people who know something, a little bit about the areas that you are trying to figure out the racial gap on. This picture is also a few years back, showing us at a roundtable, having a discussion with minority investment managers who were facing challenges in being represented across the nation in the investment manager world. Even though you don't have the answers, what you want to do is take your time to learn the inner workings of all your colleagues' job, and you want to make sure that you take a collaborative solution to it. Your job as a Chief Diversity Officer is going to be to figure out what the pattern is and what the statistics are around that, and how that overlaps with racial inequity, the historical part of racial inequities. Together with your partners, with the stakeholders in the room, you can come up with solutions. Lesson number 3, the best solutions are going to come from the ones closest to the problem. You always want to stay informed and engage with communities directly on what's impacted by your decisions. This is a picture of when we announced the push for chief diversity officers. It wasn't just that we woke up one day and decided we need to have chief diversity officers in every single agency, and that the mayor had to do an executive order on it. We had a coalition of people around the city who agreed that this was of top priority, but that brought that solution to us that said, you know, the fact that you guys were able to have a chief diversity officer and it's been successful, we need to have that across each agency and more. And some books I wanted to share with all of you that I've read that have really helped me get a better understanding of the patterns of systemic racism, those patterns that are bigger than just a specific organization, that really have to do with historical context, that I would recommend for all of you, is Brown is the New White by Steve Phillips. The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap, especially if you're in the finance world, that is a wonderful book to kind of give you a sense of why, how redlining played such a big role in how money is distributed. There's the McKinsey and Company report on why diversity in the workplace matter, if you're thinking of diversity through the HR perspective. There's our report, if you want to get a sense of how city government has racial inequities, and it's called Making the Grade. We put that together every year annually. And then the McDonald's CDO, Patricia Sowell, she put together a book called None of Us is as Good as All of Us. I have it here on my desk. It has McDonald's on it, but you can also try to pick up the book, and that way you just hear from another chief diversity officer that person's challenges and what they did in a company that was really predominantly white. Some fun 4 pieces of advice is that being a chief diversity officer is only cool in webinars. It is not a fun, enthusiastic role on a day-to-day basis. It actually, the core of being chief diversity officer is that you have to be very comfortable making other people uncomfortable and you feeling uncomfortable. The biggest part of this role, 80% of this job, is coming up with new innovative ways to do something that no one else has done before. It's like you're recreating Rosa Parks every day, sitting in front of the bus in a place where no one had ever thought a Black American can sit in front of the bus. But in a much more bureaucratic way when you're doing it inside of an organization. But it means you need to be comfortable in your own skin. You need to be comfortable in the way you present and your numbers. And that's why I say, like, your data is gonna be critical, because many times in this role, it's very easy, since if you're a person of color, if you're a woman, and you hear someone tell you that they don't want to do a certain policy, that you can take it personal, because that's normal. You're a human being. So you wanna make sure that you have your evidence so you can level your own head out and really come up with recommendations that help everyone. This is not supposed to be an adversarial role, just for those of you watching, especially for the young people watching that you're just coming up. As exciting as that sounds, a collaborative role, this is a compliance role. This is about making sure that you are leveling the playing field and that this role has to be bigger than you. It has to be beyond you. That's my advice number 2. It needs to be sustainable. Everything you do has to be sustainable beyond you. That means you have to build it like a machine so that you can exit yourself out of it and the next person coming in can redo what you do and add to it. That's super critical as well. You also have to make sure that you work, that you can that the work, understand that the work has ups and downs. Look at people through the lens of growth. Someone who you're working with now may have not been ready to receive your advice, and then like later on is all about it and is proactive about helping you on diversity initiatives. You just have to get people to a point that they'll be ready to remove any barriers that won't allow for women and people of color to have access. And most people that you talk to, and I'm not trying to be like sugarcoat this, but will end up having the same mission. Your job is to help them figure out how they can do that in their own job in terms that make everyone move towards the mission. The last piece of advice is have fun. Have fun. Please have fun. This does not have to be a sad job every day. It can be exhausting because no one wants to be in front of systemic racism every single day. I get to work with it every day. I have fun with it. You can ask Jessica. Jessica works with me every day and she has fun with it. Kevway's on the call. She has fun with it too. But this stuff does not come easy. You have to have a long-term view. You have to be almost a loyalist as you're thinking about the ideas that you want to put out there. And sometimes some things take a month and sometimes other things take 7 years. We had pushed for the Chief Diversity Officer in every single agency. We said it every year for 7 years, and it happened on the 7th year. And we never gave up on it. So some things take longer than others, but they're definitely worth it, especially when you're making history. So without further ado, I think this is the last slide, I believe. And if you have questions, you can reach us at diversity@controller.nyc.gov. I'm going to pass it over to Jessica, who will open it up for questions.
Thank you, Wendy. That was great. And judging by the feedback from the chat, I gather people are really enjoying this. I will say there's a couple of questions going in the chat. If you have a question that you want Wendy to answer, please put it in the Q&A box, and I'm going to open that box now, and I'm going to pull all the questions from there. But thank you, everyone, for your great feedback in the chat box. All right, Wendy, we have lots of questions. Okay, I'm going to start at the top, and we're just going to go through as many as we can. So we have a question from Dawn. Dawn says, my interests lie with the working class poor in New York City, especially in Manhattan, where we are invisible and treated as such. How can I combine social justice with a theater and law interest?
Oh my God, this is a God-sent question. Yes. So one of the most exciting things in the last year is that Chief Diversity Officers are now being hired in every single sector. So if you are interested in the theater sector, you will see that there are Broadway shows that are hiring Chief Diversity Officers. You will find, as I said earlier, the Metropolitan Opera just hired a Chief Diversity Officer. The Broadway League just hired a Chief Diversity Officer. And I'm trying to think of other places that hired as well in the arts and entertainment world. The Recording Academy has a Chief Diversity Officer. A CDO is, has a social justice component, of course. So if you have those three interests, I would say have your interests be the organization, have your skill set be the Chief Diversity Officer, and you can take your skill set and apply it in any single industry. The most beautiful thing is when you can have both. So take a look at those organizations, and I would say if they don't have a Chief Diversity Officer, recommend that they do and that they hire you, because the truth is everyone needs one. And as long as you have the background for it, I wouldn't see why anyone wouldn't be open to that.
Thank you, Wendy. The next question comes from Brian. Brian wants to know, how does the CDO role differ between government and business? Are the required qualifications different for the CDO in government or in business?
So the Chief Diversity Officer role does not differ in terms of where it lives in an organization. When done correctly, because there are people that don't do it correctly, when done correctly, it always lives at the top of the organization, working collaboratively across all sectors. That is the same in business and in government, just like the vice versa, that if you have someone in the business sector that's doing programming around diversity, or someone in government doing programming around diversity, that is not an accurate representation of like where. I just want to say that in that it really doesn't differ that much. What changes is the type of industry you're impacting. So when you're in business, you are impacting vendors and other business and business in the business world. And when you're in government, you're answering to the constituents of New York City. Your audience changes, but it's normally similar formula.
Thank you. We have another question. Do you think that there are really cultural changes within organizations and government agencies with CDOs?
You know, to be honest with you, I think there's some places.
Did you get that, Wendy?
Yeah. I was saying, to be really honest with you, I think there are places where it exists, where you have major cultural changes and shifts. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. And then there are, of course, agencies that don't have major cultural shifts. So do I believe that it exists? Absolutely. I can tell you that in the Comptroller's office, when we first started, none of our numbers represented a culturally diverse organization. And if you look at us now, we're at 9.5 million with women and minorities, which means 50% of the people that we do business with in this office are people of color and or a woman. Our cabinet is fully diverse. We have more women on the cabinet than men in general, and almost 60% are women or people of color. So was that like that before we got here? No, I don't think those numbers existed, but there's been a shift, and I think the more you work at it, the more it grows.
Thank you. Caitlin would like to know if you have looked at the numbers for disabled employees as well.
Yes, part of diversity work is looking at everybody. I mean, the reality behind is that you have to get a sense of how the disability community is doing. You have to get evidence on how LGBTQ community is doing in order to really look at where the disparities are. There's also disparities among the disparities. I mean, we talk about that a lot. And in order to correct for that, you have to work focusing on that.
Okay, Olivia would like to know about other agencies that have followed in the Comptroller's office's steps and hired their own CDOs in the last 8 years.
Yeah, just in the last year, just to give you context, it's Olivia, right? It's the person's name.
Olivia.
It's Olivia. Having a mandate to have a chief diversity officer only happened last summer. Of that took about 6 months. So this is very recent. We're only seeing in the last 6 months people getting hired at a local level to be CDOs. So the Department of Sanitation did not have a chief diversity officer in the past, and it hired one. The Department of Youth and Community Development didn't have a chief diversity officer in the past, but then they hired a specialist to deal with that. The Department of Transportation as well. I'm trying to think of other places, and a very special organization. About 8 years ago, when we announced having a chief diversity officer, the commissioner at the time for the Department of DDC, which is it's the construction department for the city of New York, hired a chief diversity officer after we made an announcement. So some agencies were really smart and did it quickly. When we made the first call, some agencies were a lot slower and waited to the executive order to come in.
Okay, thank you. Peter has a question. How does your office define people of color, and how do you know if a board member is or is not a person of color?
Yeah, well, people have to disclose, of course. We can't assume someone is a person of color without asking them. And so people have to disclose, and we do it by government standards, the same standards that they use in the census.
Thank you. Dawn has another question. What is the process of grading? I think that's the MWBE letter grades. And how has the grading changed since you first started it?
Okay, that's a deep question. The grade, I will try to do this in 30 seconds or less. Okay, so we grade each city agency based on what they spend. So for example, if we're looking at a Department of Citywide Administrative Services, or we're looking at the department and they are focusing more on construction, we make sure that our grading system is putting more level on those in those areas. It's A, B, C, D, just like in school. You get an A when you do well in all 4 categories. You do well with Hispanic, women, Black, and Asian. And then what we do is that we look at what's called Local Law 1. Local Law 1 is the city's law that determines what percentage has to go to each ethnicity by industry and by professional services, and we combine it with that. If that sounds too boring to you or it sounds super exciting, I recommend that you read the back of Making the Grade, and it gives you a very detailed outline on how we do the grading system. There was another question and I forgot it.
It was about how we grade and if grading has changed from when we started to now.
I think so. Do you think so, Jessica? I think it's changed. When we first started, we started grading and people were like, oh, this is crazy. Why are you guys doing this? Nobody cares. It was just like we had so much feedback about why this wasn't a good idea. And then we kept doing it and kept doing it. And we saw the shift. We saw commissioners calling and they were like, hey, I saw that I got an F grade. What do I need to do to change? I don't want to fail with African Americans. I don't want to fail with Hispanic. I don't want to fail with women. So we started seeing the push little by little, not all the way through, but little by little, we did get feedback from people who wanted to make a difference and do their job in a way that was equitable.
Okay, we have a question from Sifat. The question is, I just graduated recently, majoring in behavioral science and communications tech. What are some soft skills that I should focus on? Is knowledge regarding affirmative action law and its execution still relevant despite our governor not requiring it as mandatory?
Yeah, someone requiring anything as mandatory or not doesn't mean something's not relevant. I don't think anyone determines whether something's relevant. Look, let me just start from scratch. Systemic racism exists, period. It is in every single part of what we do. It is in the food we eat. It is in our access to housing. It lives in banks. It lives in, and so once you have an understanding of how systemic racism works, you can apply it to your area of industry. So in your case, and give me the person's name again.
I'm sorry, I think it was Sifat, but I've scrolled past.
In your case, Sifat, if you're interested in health or public health, I believe that's what's said, then you're gonna be working in hospitals. And one of the biggest detriments that you will find in healthcare is that people of color, particularly African Americans and Hispanics, are facing a huge gap when it comes to healthcare. So you're gonna have to solve for that, whether you wanna address it head on or you're gonna see it in the back end, whether you're seeing it as a doctor or you're seeing it on the administrative side. So learning about, in your case, I would say would be critical, learning about how hospitals have come up, how public health system, maybe how Medicare and Medicaid began. All those systemic inequities, all of those things have to do with systemic racism. And once you understand that, you're going to be able to service people better and do your job at a higher stance.
Okay, here's another interesting question from Abdul. I've worked as a consultant in DEI, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion, for several years, and I'm hesitant in taking on a CDO role as my livelihood would be tied to the very institution that I'm offering tough advice or criticism to. How do you balance being forthcoming with an institution that governs your livelihood?
I mean, I think you have to remember that and people are bringing you in, whether it's on the consulting side or you're working inside of the organization. They're bringing you in to give them recommendations that work. If you've been doing this work similar, we've been doing it now for 10 years, 8 years. I feel like we've been here 8 years. You're gonna have things that people take and then they don't take. I find it fruitful for me. I mean, I can tell you, I find it fruitful in that I get to see something when it starts and then see the finish of it. That is the benefit of being a chief diversity officer inside of the organization. I get to tell you that we started at $1 million and ended at 9.5 million. Whereas when you're a consultant, you get to give the recommendation and move on, give the recommendation and move on, give the recommendation and move on. You actually don't have the same reward than when you stay and you see it the whole way through. The same way it can be frustrating if you give a recommendation and then no one takes it on. I didn't have that experience here in the controller's office where I gave a recommendation and didn't see it through or didn't get the support. I think choosing where you want to work as chief diversity officer is really the critical part. You are as much interviewing the president of that organization as they are interviewing you. So just choose a place that you know is committed, because if they're committed and they understand that this is a long game, you'll be very happy. You just have to be clear that this takes time.
Thanks, Wendy. The next question is from Moose, and Moose asks, as CDO, are there trainings or workshops that you or your unit lead? What kinds of topics do they cover, and who is the audience for those trainings or workshops?
Yes, actually, we do. We created an institute that has trained over thousands of women and minority-owned businesses and thousands of women and people of color. That's called MWBE University. The idea behind it is that we talk about topics that help build wealth in these communities. So, for example, we just did one on how to be a chief diversity officer for MWB University. Similar to what you're seeing today. We do other topics on how to navigate through city government, specifically just for women and people of color. Sometimes we talk about how to sit on a board, because we know that there's not enough recruiting efforts happening with women and people of color, and people have to understand, like, how do you sit on a board? How do you get this job? So the topics vary depending on the time, but if you want to check that out, I can have Edway put on the chat, the MWB University. Oh, there it goes. Events, it should be in the chat that are coming up.
Okay. I've got a question, another question from Brian. Job burnout is common among individuals working to address issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Are you experiencing roadblocks and organizational resistance to your efforts? If so, how do you maintain your motivation?
Oh, I want to say that being a person of color is exhausting. Let's just start from scratch, especially these days when everyone is like trying to address white privilege and how it looks when in the workplace, how it looks here. Everyone's trying to figure out who they are, how they identify. That in itself, the becoming of the becoming can be exhausting. So working in it, because everyone's doing their own work, working in it, that's another layer. The exhaustion does not come in any work that you do without a reward. It's not that you're on a spiraling wheel, it's that you're on a growth wheel. And so what you really have to do is understand that dealing with systemic racism is like dealing with a massacre. It's like going to a hospital and watching like a bunch of people wanting to be the doctor to fix it all. You got to do it one by one. Like everyone, there's death everywhere. And so you just have to, there's a saying in Spanish, there's a saying that says like, eat the elephant one spoon at a time. So has anyone ever heard that? I don't know.
I didn't hear it.
But it's like, you're supposed to eat the elephant one spoon. I don't know why you eat the elephant and why it's one spoon at a time, but whatever. Maybe I'm messing this up. But the idea is that you take something really big as systemic racism, and then you choose your battles. Do I get exhausted? Of course. I think Jessica can tell you, it's been many times I have sat in exhaustion. Not anything to do with the organization I work for. It's just that this work hurts. It hurts to look at numbers that reflect you and know that your community didn't receive their fair share. That hurts. And so to top it off with trying to create a solution right away can make you feel overwhelmed. You just have to shake it off and keep moving else. And when you have evidence and stats and data backing you up, you'll see that this work will become more of a fabric of the way you do it. It'll have a flow. But of course, it has its days, but it has a lot more better days. I will tell you that much.
Okay, another question from Dawn. How are minority businesses being helped with the pandemic situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. In the last year, we actually had to be super aggressive because we were only doing things online. As everybody knows, everything was shut down. We had to focus on doing many workshops for women and minority-owned businesses, especially those who didn't speak the language, who were non-English speaking, because now the access to government was all online, and that was another barrier. So we had COVID-related workshops in our office that really included entrepreneurs who wanted to learn about how to sell masks to the city, because the city was one of the few functioning procurement and spending spaces in New York. There were people who wanted to learn about not just how to buy masks and make masks, and ventilators were a big issue, of course, as you all know, last year. And then there were companies, minority-owned companies, that wanted to learn how to do that. Laptops were being bought at a rapid pace because who knew we were going to need so many laptops in a matter of 3 days. And there were many minority distribution companies that would do that. Air ventilators were a big issue. We had to push around that. So we focused a lot of efforts on seeing what the demand was and where there were minority businesses that can meet that demand, and going straight into those companies so they can help us with that.
Okay, we have a few more questions. So Wendy, if you have a few more minutes, we can just get through a couple more. Let's see. I'm trying to get to some that are unique questions, because some people have the same ones. Okay, this is a question from Rose. Wendy, how do you self-care when you have so much on your shoulders?
As Jessica knows, I like to take long vacations and walks on the beach. No, I'm kidding. It's true. I do.
She isn't.
I really do that. Reading helps me a lot, because reading gives me, this is like I'm reading, just the McDonald's book. It kind of reminds you that you're not doing this work alone. It also, reading about systemic racism gives you a sense that this is such a bigger topic. It's bigger than you. It's also soothing. So reading, 1. 2, I have a very active therapist that I meet with every Monday, and it's a place for me to really just like exhaust everything. This can also take a turn on your life, because as you're solving the problems of the world, you're always feeling like, maybe like, what are you worthy? Are you worthy enough to do this? Are you giving the right solution? And then you never want to disappoint your community. So there's a lot of like internal emotional pressure that you feel that you have to work through. So I recommend that it doesn't matter what you're in, but if you work in an exhaustive environment, I think doctors and people like that, especially during COVID, therapists are key. So get a therapist. But I really do try to, I come at this work from the perspective that I'm going to do it one thing at a time. And I don't have to solve the whole bubble. I can solve this, and then I can solve for here. And 1 win is better than 0 wins. I don't have to have 10. I can just have 1 good one. And I can just do that every day. And eventually you get to 10, and then 20, and then 100.
Vanya asks, how can this work be duplicated in other states? I recently moved to Tallahassee, Florida, and I see that the position will be very helpful here.
Oh, yeah. Actually, funny enough, in our office, Kavan and Patty, who are part of our team, are doing some work now in looking at what's happening with chief diversity officers outside of New York. And the highest percentage, I think Kavan is on the call, he should be watching, but the highest percentage of chief diversity officers are being hired outside of New York. So we are seeing places like Tennessee. I believe Kavan said to me, and I don't know if you can write in the chat, that they just hired at the Tennessee Arts Museum. They hired someone who was a chief diversity officer. So be on the lookout and look, if the position doesn't exist, create it for someone. It's always a necessity. It's not a debatable space.
We have a few questions that are in a similar vein. First is Priscilla is asking how you get your foot in the door. Are there entry-level positions you can recommend? I saw another question about internship opportunities in our office, and I see a few questions about what kinds of skills or training would help people get into the field.
Yeah.
So I know you spoke about it a little bit already, but maybe you can dig into that area a bit more.
Yeah, I think there's a few things. If you work in city government, I used to be an EO officer in the office. I think that was helpful. Now looking back on it, it's an equal opportunity officer when you're looking at specifically like the numbers of women and people of color throughout the office. I think that's helpful if you're in city government to give you perspective. If you are let's say you're working with a company that's hiring businesses and you want to be in charge of like the coordinator for supplier for and you specifically focus on supplier diversity. That's another area that is super critical. If you work in the corporate world and you're in corporate governance, looking at how the board is encompassed and working maybe with the board of trustees on that. Even if you're just the coordinator on helping them on that, that's another space. But if you're at a university or you want to work at a university, there are doing diversity programming. I just want to tell you, and this may sound, I think it's mostly students, not all students in the room, but I used to be the president of the Hispanic Association at my college. And before that, I was like the recruitment committee. And when the provost came to the University of Delaware, I was one of the students that pushed for diversity and inclusion, never understanding that this was going to be my job, by the way, 15 a lot years later. It was a long time ago. And I do think that all those things added one more layer of experience to get me to where I am. So if you're working in disenfranchised communities, I would say you're already starting in the right foot. Combine that with a little reading, do a little statistics on that, and then keep working your way up, because the idea is that you need to become C-suite level and chamber level or cabinet level, because that's an administrative skill. You can build your way into being CDO very quickly.
Okay, next question. How do you create realistic benchmarks regarding doing business with and hiring minorities and women, given that they make up a lesser portion of the market and application pool? It would appear that if qualifications and recruiting efforts are held equal, minorities and women would be smaller in number.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a great question, because actually it is the one myth that everyone believes, is that there's not enough. I think you first have to go backwards. Ask yourself the number one question. We did that in our office, which is, what's the availability, right? So first you have to not assume that there's no availability. You have to actually get the numbers behind it. We in our office, when we were looking, let's say, for an accountant, and we wanted an accountant, before we decided we wanted an accountant who we wanted, we created what's called a market analysis. And we did an analysis on how many accountants of color are there in the US. Does it require a lot of time and effort? Yes, but we made it part of the protocol and we established a formula. And what we would find is that every single time we did our work, remember, Jessica, it would always come out that there were plenty of talented accountants who were women and people of color. And so then it was really more about government doing their piece, meaning our office doing our piece, to advertise that opportunity to that market. So why it's so important to do a market analysis, because market analysis not only is a good business decision, but it'll actually give you up-to-date information on who is out there, and it doesn't allow you to apply myths.
I think we'll maybe just do one or two more questions. There's quite a lot in the Q&A, but some of them are duplicates. And if anyone wants to follow up even further after this, you can email diversity@comptroller.nyc.gov. And a few of the questions are asking if we can share either a recording or the reading list or the PowerPoint. So we'll put together something with resources and send it to those of you who signed up and registered, so you have some of this if you want to refer back. But one more question. Under the previous presidential administration, there was an official denial of the existence of racism in the US. If there is another switch in the federal government, will the current trend to establish CDO roles be reversed? Will there be no job security for people who pursue careers in diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Oh, that's a good question. So I don't work in federal government, but I can just give you, and so I don't want to give you, I want you to take my words with a grain of salt. This is my understanding. Biden put in the executive order, and in turn that formulated chief diversity officers across the nation. So at least when that happens and you have an executive order under that elected officials administration, it's a absolute go. It means it stays. Executive orders have to turn into law eventually. Anything in government, whether it's federal or it's the state or it's local, laws like charter mandates, those are the things that really govern whether something is sustainable. So chief diversity officers would have to become a law, the same way we saw with affirmative action in law, in order for it to be permanently forever. I'm going to give you an example. In New York City, the small business program that's focused on women and minority-owned businesses called MWB program, for many years, for over 2 decades, had been a staple program, but it was not a charter commission program. All that meant is that every single time a new leader came in, this is also true for the federal government, when a new leader comes in, it can be prioritized or not prioritized. It doesn't get taken away, but it's like, it can do that. When it's charter mandated in the city, when it's charter mandated in the federal government, it goes higher on the priority list. So if you are a student and you wanted to advocate for chief diversity officers to be legislated, that would be excellent. That would be a wonderful cause to push. You can do the same thing for the federal government. Maybe they're already doing that. I'm actually just not sure. But if you want, you can Google Biden's executive order for his first 100 days. They did an equity assessment. And Kavan in our office can send it to those of you who are interested. If you email diversity@comptroller.nyc.gov, we can get you those executive orders. I'm just not up to date if in the last month, there has been some kind of legislation that went through on the federal side, but we can share with you where you can find that information.
Okay, thank you, Wendy. I think we're going to wrap there, but I want to thank everyone who joined us from our internship program, our fellowship program, and from the broader CUNY community. We're so thrilled you could all be here, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Wendy, thank you for being so generous with your time and your knowledge. And I can tell from the chat box that you inspired a lot of people, and a lot of people were really interested in what you had to share today. So those of you that would like more information, just email diversity@comptroller.nyc.gov, and someone from Wendy's team will follow up with you, and we'll put together an email and send you some additional resources that may be helpful to you all.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Kevway, who's on the call. Thank you to Javier, who did our closed captions. And thank you to Kevway, who was here sharing slides. Everyone have a wonderful day.